back and forward in time and have a few little segues. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint. I've got some kind of fun stuff in here. And so, to kind of get started, the history of radio is obviously a really broad topic. And in order to do any kind of a presentation in just an hour on the history of radio, there needs to be a focus to it. It needs to have some sort of a direction that we're going to take. And so I gave this one a lot of thought how we would present here at the LeMay, and talking with Dick and with Stacy and just kind of thinking through what we're going to do here. What I decided to do, since you have a collection of radios and you go see the radios and they've got placards on them that say what they are and when they are, I was thinking that maybe it would be more interesting for people who have an interest in radio to maybe dispel a lot of what you think about the history of radio and where it really did come from. Most people, you say, where did radio come from? Oh, well, it was invented by Marconi. And there's a lot more to the story than that. So what this presentation is going to be, we're going to start around 1820 and go into the 1920s, because it took that whole 100-year period of time for all of the concepts that we know as radio to come about. It didn't just happen one day, like a lot of other things in invention. So that's the kind of the focus of it. So I thought it would be interesting to go back and meet some of the people and just show you some of the things that each one of these persons contributed individually to the development of radio over that 100-year period. So first up, we're going back to the 1820s with a guy named Hans Oersted in Denmark. He was one of the very first physicists to ever study magnetic fields. And I chose to start with him rather than going back to volta for the volt, or going back into really early periods. Once magnetic fields started to get studied, that's when all the moments started happening, because some interesting things started come out of those studies. Oersted demonstrated principles and effects with magnetism that would become integrated into virtually all the aspects of electricity, electronics, and one day, long after his death, radio itself. He laid the foundation of magnetic fields and knew that there was something more to them. It wasn't just a magnet that can pick up a piece of metal. There was more to magnets than what we thought. And to this day, he had a unit of measure named after him called the Oersted. It's still used by engineers every day for the study of magnetic fields. We use that abbreviation. The next person in our list is a name that most people will know, and it's André-Marie Ampère from France in the late 1820s. And he's the guy that founded the science of classical electromagnetism, taking the work of Oersted and demonstrating that electricity and magnetism are actually very related to each other. And he started building a very solid science around electromagnetism for the first time. And of course, radio is an electromagnetic medium. So again, that's why we're back in this time period, because these are the core technologies that have to be present for radio to ever occur. And of course, if you've ever said that you're all amped up about something, well, you're using the unit of measure that is named for Mr. Ampere, which of course is the amp, which I think most people certainly know that unit of measure. Then we moved to the U.S. in the 1830s with Joseph Henry. Now, Henry was more of a practical science inventor kind of a guy. He was all about taking gizmos that had been created or coming up with new gizmos that he invented himself and improving them. And he had a knack for fiddling with all things electromagnetic. So he was the guy that gave us the very first electromagnetic devices like an electromagnet or a relay, which is a form of electromagnet that's used was used in the development of telegraphy. And so because of the work of Joseph Henry, that's what gave us telegraph sounders. And of course, once we have telegraph, now more of those moments where people start thinking about, wouldn't it be neat if we didn't have to have those blasted wires running from point A to point B to make it work? But the system was there. Samuel Morse was, and others, not just Morse, had developed the Morse code that could be used to communicate over wires, and people started just having those thoughts about maybe we can go beyond this. And just like Ampere and Oersted, he had a unit of measure that we still use today, and as a radio guy myself, I very much get involved with the unit of measure called Henry, because I work with transmitters and receivers, and the coils, the inductive devices inside transmitters and receivers, we have to keep track of how many millihenries or microhenries of inductance are in those coils, and that's the unit of measure that we're actually measuring with a henry is inductance. And of course, in the real world, a henry, a coil that's a henry would probably fill this room. It's a gigantic amount of inductance. So we deal in thousands and millions of a henry. In some cases, even billions. In cell phones, there's picohenry coils. So it's a very, very important unit of measure. Now we're starting to get into the really fun guys, the people that did some pretty amazing things. And Michael Faraday is certainly stands out among a lot of the early physicists, developers, engineers, and electronic tinkering dreamers. He was a lot like Tesla in a lot of ways, which we'll cover as well. He furthered the sciences that were leading to radio. He kind of took in on what a lot of other people were doing and really made some improvements in a practical way of making these technologies practical. So he's the guy that gave us the first real practical electrical motors, which would become integral in early spark transmitters. You can't have a spark transmitter without an electrical motor. And so Faraday fed into that electromechanical way of thinking. And he also figured out that a motor can also be a generator, and early dynamos, as they were called, different kind of generator than we use today typically. But he did a lot of developments in that technology as well. And again, this all relates to early transmitting gear because it all involved dynamos and electric motors. And of course, his namesake device. Can anybody name what is Faraday's big famous thing?
Faraday cage. Faraday cage?
Faraday cage. That's his big claim to fame. This is an actual photograph of somebody using a very large Van de Graaff static generator, producing somewhere in the neighborhood of a few million volts, striking a person who is inside a Faraday cage. And a Faraday cage is just a bonded metal cage. It can be screen or cage, any kind of metal, all bonded together and grounded. And it doesn't matter how many volts you hit it with, they can't go in there. That's like your little safe space. And they're used all over the world in military facilities, and people even have them in their houses for protection from EMP, electromagnetic pulse, which is a horrific terrorist tactic that has been predicted to occur at some time in the United States, most likely, where a bomb is detonated a mile high. It's too high to actually destroy anything, but it wipes out the entire electrical grid. And anything that's electronic, whether it's turned on or not, if it's solid state, is destroyed. So Faraday cages, or as they're called now, here's another great shot of a couple of girls up in a hanging cage. This was from a stage performance showing these brave girls being zapped in this cage. And she's a little hard to see probably, but she's got her hand right up to the middle on the cage while she's being zapped. But it's led to commercial developments for the work of Faraday. We have big Faraday shields, Faraday cages that go into military bases, around computer facilities. This is a commercial unit that's marketed, and this is what it looks like when it's being built. Just a metal framework that's then filled in with metal panels, and the whole thing is grounded to create a big Faraday shield. So Michael Faraday did a lot of work with electromagnetism and with spark energy, with the effects in generating high potentials, and his work with motors that would lead to spark transmitters. So he was very much at the forefront of that sort of stuff. And the Faraday cage concept has gotten so popular, especially with some of the prepper movement, that they make them for homes now. This is one you can buy and install in your living room and then sheetrock over it, and make it be your kid's bedroom. even goes to the absurd point, I kid you not, Faraday cage underwear. That's a real ad. I found this on a fluke. It's an actual advertisement from a Telegraph newspaper in London. Yours for the low everyday price is $65, and you can protect your package from radiation. It says it right there. What would Michael Faraday think? I think he would leave the room. So next up, we have another fascinating person, James Maxwell from Scotland in the 1860s. This is the guy that really brought us truly the first glimpse of what radio was. Now, Maxwell didn't build things. He didn't even build apparatus. He was completely a theoretical physicist. But he was the first one to actually predict that electromagnetic waves, radio waves, would travel through the air just like light and at the same speed as light. That was monumental. That probably, when he made those announcements and white papers and whatnot, probably came across as almost like witchcraft at the time. That had to have been a monumental thing, something you can't even see traveling at the speed of light. But he did a lot more than that. Much of his research actually paved the way for Einstein. Einstein actually considered him to be one of the greatest mathematical minds in history, Maxwell. And a lot of the work that Maxwell had done about things moving at the speed of light cut years off the time that Einstein would have had to spend doing it. He was able to take Maxwell's work and incorporate it. And his legacy goes really, really far beyond what he was doing back then. His mathematical and theoretical predictions resulted in us developing a kind of radar called cloud-penetrating radar or earth-penetrating radar. Not normal radar, it's a little bit different way it has to work. And some of the theoretical accomplishments Maxwell did actually led to this little blob of a photograph here. This was taken in 1960, and it's the first photograph using cloud-penetrating radar of the first mountain range ever seen not on planet Earth or the moon. It's actually on Venus, and because his mathematical formulas were used in a practical way to develop cloud-penetrating radar back in 1960, they named it the Maxwell Month in honor of him, because that's what led to that development. And here's a more modern picture taken by satellite of the Maxwell Month. So some of these people that were bringing these amazing technologies, they're still very much around today, and their principles and concepts being used that all contributed to the development of radio. Oops. Oh yeah, here we go. And like so many others, he also has a unit of measure that's still very much used today called the Maxwell, MX. That is what is it, magnetic flux measurement that's still used today. So now we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of words, people's names that become words we know on radio, and this is probably the first really big one, and that's Heinrich Hertz from Germany in 1887. He is the first researcher, physicist, tinkerer to systematically and unequivocally create an intentional transmission of what we call radio waves. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't an experiment, it was, he theorized that this would work and he built a device to do it, and it did what he thought it would do. That was a landmark moment because he created radio waves. His apparatus was very simple, very elegant, and those that understand anything about a schematic will get this right away, but it's a very simple idea. There's a step-up transformer where we have a primary coil on a transformer and a secondary coil on the transformer that produces a much higher voltage, and that voltage then jumps across two electrodes, and then there's big metal balls is what he used, but they later become big metal plates and ultimately would go out to antenna wires that would radiate that signal. And in Heinrich Hertz's first transmitter, the electromagnetic energy that we didn't know was called radio then, we didn't use that term, actually passed through the air in a way that he didn't really understand. He wasn't a theoretical guy, but he knew that if he put a ring of brass, I believe he used, with two balls with a much closer gap at the end of them, that every time that he keyed the key up here and made that spark happen, a little spark happened over on his gap over here. And that demonstrated that those waves, that energy predicted by Maxwell, in fact did jump through space to those other points, and it manifests itself there. And here's an actual practical adaptation of that. So here's the spark gap, and here's the little balls on the end radiating the signal. We have our Morse code key, and here's our step-up transformer. But ironically, he just dismissed the whole thing as interesting, but he said it will never have any practical purpose, which always reminds me of the head of IBM in 1954 saying that the world will only ever need 4 computers. I think I'm running about 6 of them up here right now. So sometimes these really brilliant people they don't see beyond the immediate, and that takes other people to take what they've done and go with it. But what he discovered and demonstrated, and he kind of built the science of, are what were called at the time Hertzian waves. Again, he didn't really understand them or how they worked. That would be later people that would figure that out. But we now call it radio waves. And in 1960, in honor of that, the scientific community, for the most part, agreed to change cycles per second to, I need my read glasses for the next slide, to the term hertz, which of course we all use today. And I say by and large, there's some parts of the scientific community that for whatever reason rejected that and refused to use other than cycles per second. Not sure why they do that. But by changing it to hertz, then we get all the wonderful Hertzian derived frequencies, the biggest being, of course, kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz. And even with my reading glasses, what I see is what you see.
Out of focus.
It's a little out of focus, I think, but let me see if I can fix that a little bit. Keystone. I think we had it down in enhanced, about as good as it's going to get. So we ended up with a long legacy of hertz, and that so obviously directly ties into radio, because we talk about megahertz all the time. So hertz was very pivotal in the development. But next, now we get to the people that are hero status, and a lot of people when we mention Marconi, oh, he invented radio. You can probably see by now that he didn't. What Marconi did for radio is what Henry Ford did for the automobile. Marconi, through his entire life, was aggressive, personable. He had visions and dreams, and he knew how to go out and accomplish them. And that's exactly what Henry Ford was. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile; he just made a better way to build it, and he made it incredibly popular. And Marconi did much the same, not so much a better way to build it, but he said, okay, I get it. I know what this can be used for, So he picked up where Hertz left off and said, oh, okay, I'm going to make this work. You're onto something really good here, pal. And he created a development of radio that went way beyond Hertz. So in 1901, they hoisted a 500-foot wire from a kite in Newfoundland. And by the way, they picked Newfoundland because it's the closest land area to someplace in England where they'd be able to set up to receive. Because if you look at a map of where Newfoundland is, which you'll see here in a minute, it's the closest gap to get a signal across the ocean to Europe. And while there was no press there during the actual test and transmission, by popular demand after he succeeded, he reset the entire setup. So this is a recreation of what it looked like, but taken just a few weeks after his monumental success. And this is a little video I'm going to play where you can actually hear a Marconi-built spark transmitter. This was actually built by and owned by Marconi. It's in a museum in Newfoundland near where he did his transatlantic contact, and it's not a particularly powerful transmitter. This is the same transmitter that was aboard the Titanic and the Olympic. By today's standards, it would be like the basic transceiver I use at home, a Yaesu FT950 100-watt transceiver, which For those that aren't familiar with that sort of stuff, it's just your standard ham radio. I don't have a big amplifier. I'm not like a big gun, as we call it, ham radio. It's just a decent basic transmitter, and I can talk around the world with it. But I'm not a powerhouse. That's what this was. This wasn't a hugely powerful transmitter by any stretch. But this little video here, hopefully we'll be able to hear okay on the projector. But it's just like a minute and a half long. So we'll let this play while I get a drink of water.
This is a Marconi spark gap transmitter from the early days of radio. And the way that this works essentially is that it's a big step-up transformer, and the telegraph key is a switch that turns it on and off. So when you close the contact with the telegraph key, a spark jumps across the gap between these two electrodes over here, like this. And this would also be hooked up to an antenna, so that would be spewing out radio waves across a broad spectrum of the radio frequency. The problem with these is that when one was going, the sort of strongest, loudest one was the one that could be heard, and you had trouble hearing all the rest of them.
My apologies.
Such a scramble to set up, I forgot to plug in the laptop.
You got one power, right?
Right here.
I know, but I don't know where I put the laptop power supply. Thank you for coming, everybody. No, if all else failed, down it. Nope, that's the other laptop.
You really do have 6 computers.
I know I took it out. It's not bad. Oh, wait. The guy that was operating, you notice, had a glove on. That wasn't necessarily just because it was a museum glove, you know, don't touch things. It's about 5,000 volts potential between those two electrodes. And that's no margin for error. You die. And a lot of early spark experimenters died applying their hobby, especially when they started to get up into the crazy years. Yes?
Is the antenna actually the kite?
Yes, on the transmitting end, the antenna would be the kite. So one side of the spark gap would go to a ground rod, the other side would go to the kite. And as the spark jumps across, it completes an antenna circuit up into the kite to transmit across the ocean. And to get a feel for how far that is, now you can kind of get an idea that the pointy part of Newfoundland winds up nicely with England. And, you know, give or take, you could have probably done some slightly closer path, but that's why they went from Newfoundland to England, was to try to cut that distance down. And his first contact as we call it in ham radio, but his first contact with another station to receive a signal, it's almost 2,500 miles across the ocean. Now, this is where you get a sense that Marconi, he was no dummy. He was not fiddling around here. This is the receiving antenna. He was smart enough to know that he has to have a hellaciously good antenna on the other end to pick up that signal. Transmitting it on the 500-foot wire, that's great. But receiving it, it's all about that. The receiving technology was very primitive. This was not a cheap thing to do. He knew this was going to work. He knew it. He just didn't tell the world until he did it. That's the kind of guy he was. He was a showman. He wanted to show the world this amazing thing. And that's why he became famous for doing it. And once he had actually established that contact in 1901, it actually launched a whole other new science. People started going, now how exactly did that go around the world? You know, isn't it light? Isn't it like light moves at the speed of light, all that? And, you know, of course, the science of what we call propagation started developing as a result of what Marconi did. That, in fact, the upper layers of the atmosphere are actually, for radio waves, they're mirrors. They're different kinds of mirrors, depending on the frequency, depending on the time of day. They're just different types of mirrors. Think of them as really shiny, clear mirrors sometimes, and other times it's just a wet piece of glass. You know, they can be very inefficient. But that's whole science developed out of that. And then, of course, the global hoopla. He had, you know, Marconi talks across the ocean. He was a sensation around the globe. He was, you know, like ticker tape parade in Italy kind of stuff. He had a ticker tape parade in Italy, his home country, of course. And so Marconi really truly launched the golden age of radio. That's what he's famous for, not inventing it, but for proving that this is something that can actually do things.
Was that more like a Morse code he said?
Yes, Marconi was only, good, thank you for pointing that out. Marconi was only sending Morse code. And that's going to become a really fun distinction here in just a couple of minutes. That's kind of almost like the da-da-da of my presentation is the fact that Marconi was using Morse code. And just as an interesting side note, Marconi's radio company actually provided the radio gear for the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic, which, I don't know, didn't really get played that much in the movie, but I think that's a neat factoid that a lot of people probably don't know. And there's actually only one known photograph of the radio room on the Titanic. It was considered state-of-the-art at the time, because this is the same gear that Marconi had used to talk across the ocean. And of course, this is, ship being built in 1910, so the technology had evolved that many more years and was that much better. But we only have one photograph of the actual radio room. But fortunately, James Cameron, for the 1997 movie, did do a very nice recreation. And if you Google this, you can get a much bigger view of it, anyone that wants to kind of peer into it. But over on the right, of course, you can tell that's the big spark generating transmitter, and over here is the receiving apparatus. This was undoubtedly a much more powerful transmitter than what Marconi had been using. But on the night of the sinking, right after the next morning when everybody knew that something really, really bad had happened, Marconi was actually rushed in a boat with the New York Times out to the Carpathia before he even got to the dock to interview the one surviving radio man, Harold Bride, who was all of 21 years old, one on the right there. Unfortunately, senior radio man John Phillips, he died in the sinking, and he was 25, so kind of tell that they didn't put a whole lot of experience requirements into something. It just wasn't considered that big a deal. Radio in those days on the Titanic was for rich people to send messages back home. Nobody really thought of it as being an emergency communication thing. That was really kind of an afterthought. So it didn't matter. We just put a couple of kids up there because they're just sending, hey, I love you, look at me, I'm on the biggest ship in the world, and they made money off of it. And what happened was that Marconi actually went before the investigating courts in England to give testimony from his interview with Bride and from his own experiences about how to improve radio for emergency communications. Let's downplay the sending messages back home. This saved lives. This actually saved lives, and it was recognized as such. If you think about it, if radio hadn't been on the Titanic, nobody would have lived. There's no way, because that boat would have gone to the bottom and nobody would ever have known why or where. So, that was, think about the magnitude of that, and that Marconi was right at the forefront of that. But it could have been very, very different. Very different. And this is a little fact that I don't think hardly any people ever hear about much. That out of gratitude for giving them a great deal on the radios for the Titanic and the Olympic, Marconi actually had a free first-class pass aboard the Titanic on the maiden voyage. But unfortunately, and fortunately for him, he had to be in New York 3 days earlier than the ship would have arrived. So 3 days before Titanic's maiden voyage, he went to New York on the Lusitania. And think about how different it would have been if Marconi had been aboard the Titanic and it sank, and he died with the ship. That radio thing might have been, they might have just said, no, this is stupid, don't do it. It didn't do anything to save these people. I'm not going to risk putting that stuff in my boat. We're going to go back to flares or whatever. So it could have been a very, very different outcome. So now tying back to your comment about Morse code, this is actually my favorite person in the history of radio. One Reginald Fessenden from Canada. He was working parallel to Marconi over the same time frame as Marconi, studying all the same people that everybody else was studying, and he was doing the thing just like all the other people that were playing with early radio. And he was just thinking, what's all this beeping crap? clicking in that case, you know, of Morse code. You know, I want to talk to somebody. There's got to be a better way to do this. So what Fessenden started to do was to develop voice communication. And I don't have a slide that covers it, but just for those that you know, I didn't consider it important enough to put a slide in, I guess. He actually used a spark transmitter for the first voice by running it up to 10,000 cycles per second and then modulating the spark. He was actually modulating the spark energy, which is, think about what it would take to do that. But anyway, he, on December 23rd, 1900, now that date should ring a bell because Marconi, what year did he do his transatlantic thing? 1901. This is almost a year earlier. What does Mr. Fessenden do? He makes the first ever voice radio transmission of just over 1 mile just outside of Washington, D.C. Didn't make the press that Marconi did, but it was a watershed moment in the development of radio. And I think if you actually ask most people, what do you consider radio to be? Well, talking and music coming out of a box. He invented radio. This guy there was no previous experiments, not that I've ever found any reference to, of anybody else fiddling with trying to make voices happen on radio. So you can fairly say that he actually did invent what became amplitude modulation. AM radio was born with Fessenden. And what's really cool, I did some deep digging, and I found a file you're going to hear. Now with our lesser speaker situation, you'll hear it twice. It plays on this slide and another one. But what this is a recreation of the actual sound that you would have heard on the receiving end of Fessenden's very first voice transmission. They didn't obviously record it, but this is the next best thing. Using his transmitter, which that blurry kind of picture, that's Fessenden's AM transmitter, his early one. And what he's saying, and I'll read it to you so that you know you'll hear it. I'll do it kind of in the cadence of what you're going to hear. He says, "Hello test. 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's snowing where you are, Mr. Thiessen, if it is, telegraph back and let me know." I have to do it like that because it's really hard to make out, so listen closely. I can play it twice if need be, but listen to this. I think that's absolutely astounding as a radio geek, mechanical, electrical geek, electronics geek, to think that he's actually modulating that horrific spark across those two electrodes with a human voice with nothing more than a carbon microphone. It's absolutely astounding to me that he created that development. So he stepped it up in a big way. In 1906, with a much larger, much improved transmitter, he launched this giant antenna and went on the air, okay, for the first time. This is the very first radio broadcast in the history of radio broadcasts. And he read the biblical account of the birth of Jesus from Luke chapter 2 in the Bible, and then he played "O Holy Night" on his violin as he sang "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men of goodwill." This was the world's very first radio broadcast, the very first AM radio broadcast, no less. Fessenden really, he should have had a lot more, I don't know, maybe he just didn't go out there and put himself out there and say, "Look what I did." You know, this should have been just monumental news. For the most part, Fessenden is largely forgotten by most people who talk about early radio. This is the only known photograph of him seated at the desk in which he did this very first broadcast. Unfortunately, the actual transmitter isn't at the desk. They're doing something else here because the transmitter that he used was quite giant, and I do have a picture of it, and it looked like this. Picture very high power because we're modulating that spark very inefficiently. But let's go ahead and hear that sound bite again, and just so you can kind of picture what it would be like to see him standing in front of this, shouting into that horn that's playing into a little carbon microphone element down here, which is basically like what you have in an old-timey telephone. And then that carbon element is just modulating the high voltage going to the spark transmitter. So here we go again with that little sound bite. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Even if it is hard to understand, it's just, if you get the technology that's, or lack of it, that's a pretty amazing thing.
Who was receiving these messages though?
Well, in that case, it was, those people tend to be lost. That's a great question, and I tried to find answers to those, and it's largely lost to history. You know, it was somebody that was just technical enough to manage the doing of it, but they weren't part of the development. It was just Mr. Thiessen was probably just a tinkerer friend of his that in and of himself made no developments, made no accomplishments to go anywhere. He just happened to be the Mr. Watson to Alexander Graham Bell. He just happens to be the guy that was on the other end. So it's kind of sad. I had hoped to have more information on who the receiving people were.
Well, was he hoping though that who would listen to it when he was doing the Christmas Eve broadcast?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point, and I guess I missed mentioning that. What he was doing with that Christmas Eve thing was he was transmitting, in that case, he was broadcasting. He was hoping that ships at sea would hear him. Now, there's no record that anybody did. Not that I could find, but that's what he was hoping to do. Because he figured that his range was probably equivalent to Marconi's by that point, and that he's broadcasting out into the great ocean, and the odds are probably highly great, almost inescapably great, that dozens and dozens of ships heard it. Because back then, in the days of spark gap transmitters, which this was, it was amplitude modulation, but still amplitude modulating sparks. It was sort of a size matters kind of a thing. The biggest signal won. So if my spark transmitter is really, really powerful, it's going to override any others that can be heard, just because of the detector technology. We'll get to that here shortly. So any ship that was within receiving range that was hearing his signal strong, is just going to blank out everybody else's signals, and his is going to be the one that's heard.
And plus the ships are listening for Morse code transmission, but then they would hear something like this.
Can you imagine? Can you just imagine the radio man running in saying, I don't understand, I'm hearing voices, boss. You know, and the kind of detector we'll get to, the kind of detector they were using, it wasn't a clack, clack, clack sounder. It was a thing called a coherer. And we'll get to that, but it's a granular type detecting device that, yeah, generally interpreted as clacks, or more commonly as prints on paper tape. But it would be perfectly capable of reading a modulated spark gap transmitter, and that's what we're hearing. That's a coherer detector that's actually receiving a spark gap amplitude modulated signal. That's why it sounds so raspy, you know, because it's remarkable. I mean, just imagine what the people on the ships saying, you're not going to believe this. You are just not going to believe this. Quit drinking and get back to the radio. So, in 1909, we get the Nobel Prize for Physics, people all together, and radio now has just become this thing. It exists. The technology is out there. And so that year, Marconi and German physicist and inventor Karl Braun shared the Nobel Prize for Physics for developments made in the science of radio. And I don't want to downplay anything that Braun did. He did a lot of very important developments that we didn't cover, because there's so many people. If we covered everybody, we'd be here for a week. He did a lot of good stuff. He developed a lot of techniques and technologies and things. But poor old Reginald Fessenden, in my opinion, he is the true inventor of AM radio as we really know it. And there is a whole Fessenden camp out there that think Fessenden really got the dirty end of the 1909 Nobel Prize for Physics. So he never got one until today. So because it's my presentation, and I think he should have a Nobel Prize just for one day. Does anybody object, Mr. Fessenden? Oh, well, in that case, well done, Mr. Fessenden. Now he's got his his Nobel Prize hanging around his neck, and I even went out and bought him a nice frame for it. So there you go. I think he should have been the co-winner of the Nobel Prize, because he really, his development really gave us what everybody in this room considers radio to be, except for the one or two that might consider Morse code in that equation. But 99.999% of the humans on this earth would not consider Morse code radio, like Cairo in our car. So now we move on to Edward Branley, and this is one of those times where I have to kind of go back a little bit in time, because we have to talk about these detecting technologies. In order for a radio to happen, you have to detect that signal. It has to be decoded from the air, demodulated in a technical sense. And technically the first detector was the little ring that Hertz created, where we're inducting a little spark across the spark gap. But that's not really a detector in the classical sense. Edward Branley developed the first detecting device called a coherer. And it was called that because it was actually, in practice, a little glass vial filled with iron filings. And when presented with an incoming radio signal, which is electrical, the weak electrical charge would make the filings cling together magnetically. And the word cohere, to mean to cling. And thus they would conduct, causing a telegraph sounder clack, or, as I said, more commonly, and you'll see the invention here shortly, a printer to actually print the Morse code. Most often it was printed when using the coherer detectors. There's a lot of drawbacks to a coherer detector. The first being that the iron filings start clumping and clumping and clumping, and after maybe a word, you'd have to tap them, and there are all kinds of little tappers. They tap their coherer. Tap it too hard and you break it, now you're off the air until you buy a new coherer. So they had some drawbacks. Probably the poor guy in the radio receiving Fessenden's broadcast was probably going nuts with his tapper, because that signal's just pouring in continuously, and he's probably having to tap it to get those iron filings to release each other and then clump up again. So it was a very inefficient technology. And so this is, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is actually one of the solutions that came out of the coherers. They're trying to make them better. They're trying to figure out something, how do we make this better, instead of looking at a new technology. So here's actually a printer. That's the paper tape we pass through, and there's a electromagnet solenoid here that's pulling in a little inked tapper that's tapping on the paper. Of course, up at the top here, this is that's our aerial coming down into our tuned circuit that's tuned to roughly the frequency range where the radio waves are expected, that then feeds into the coherer detector. And then once that cohesion happens and the electricity passes down through, conducts through a battery, which then pulls in a contact, which then sends voltage up to another set of electromagnets that have a little arm on them that taps the coherer. So every single dot and dash that comes into this, you have a dot clack, dot clack, dot clack. So it's constantly, redoing the filings. It's really clunky as the point of all that. It's like, not the simplest solution to a problem. And so here's an actual, in practice, coherer clacker of that design. And it would allow high-speed code to be sent. So you had to send really slow in the coherer days. And this would allow much higher speed Morse code involved. So something better had to come along, and again, so we're kind of in the past here a little bit, but the crystal radio was the first big solution to that. And dual credit has to be given, and is now granted to be given to two different people. On the left, Sir Jagadish Bose of India, and no, he's not related in any way to Bose Audio. I'm not even positive that's how you say his name, I'm assuming it's Bose. And the guy on the right is an American greenleaf picker. And there was a lot of patent dispute that it didn't end until the 1940s, but they're now equally recognized as developers of the crystal radio. But Bose is unique in that he was the first one to essentially develop semiconductors. Pickering was doing it differently. Bose was using the first metallic crystal detector, which is based on a metal called galena, form of lead sulfide. And so it's a crystal like any other crystal, except it's a metallic crystal. And what was used to detect the signal, the property that Bose discovered is that a metallic crystal has an ability to rectify AC signals, and radio waves are AC signals. It has the ability to pull that intelligence out of the air, just to use simple terms on it. And by using a metallic crystal, you can pull those signals out of the air because of the semiconductor properties of the galena. So a little device became extremely common called a cat's whisker detector, and it's called that because there's a little rotating arm with a small, usually brass wire on the end of it that looks like a cat's whisker, and it's in contact with a little piece of galena crystal that's been potted into lead in a little brass container. And this essentially was the world's very first true semiconductor. A galena cat's whisker is absolutely a semiconductor device, like a diode or a transistor in those kinds of categories. So it was a monumental moment in the development of a lot of things, not just radio. And early crystal sets started to just explode on the market because the detection capability of a galena cat's whisker detector was orders of magnitude greater than a coherer. I mean, this now made actual spoken voice detectable. And so we're going to hear, this is going to be even harder to hear, but the one characteristic of crystal radios is they're never very loud. And a lot of people try to come up with horns to make them play into a room, but they were never loud, they were always tinny, they still are. Just the nature of the beast, because there's no amplifiers yet. But this is what actually tuning with a cat's whisker would sound like. So listen really carefully on this one.
There are different places on the crystal that would produce stronger and weaker signals. That's a good spot.
Now that's pretty loud in headphones. He's got a pair of headphones sitting there. That's pretty loud, but it's still not family sitting around the room listening too loud. You know, it's very much a private thing. This is the first iPod. It's private listening and not intended for everybody else in the room to listen to. And, you know, Dad could sit and listen to his ball game, you know, while Mom knitted and didn't have to listen to sports.
How many of those were sold? Were they sold?
Millions upon millions upon millions upon millions. I would guess probably 50 million, 60 million crystal radios were sold. They were the dominant technology for radio reception for 16 years. And it was at the era when broadcasting was really starting to explode. And they were the first viable commercial AM radio product ever. And the brilliant thing about them from a marketing perspective is they're bloody simple. They are so simple. In its most basic form, a crystal radio is three components: a coil, a diode, and an earphone. And so over the 16 years, you can see kind of a progression of basic, primitive, and fancy, still primitive. Then we'll make them out of metal and look a little shinier. As those 16 years went on, you know, manufacturers, it's just like iPhone 6, now you need an iPhone 7, an iPhone 8, and iPhone 9. They're doing the same things. They're using the same basic technology, and they're just adding features to it. You know, an iPhone 6 is not that much different than an iPhone 1. It's just they convinced us we need it. And that's what these guys were doing with radios back then. And it got to the point of the absurd. They're starting to build these radios that look like spaceships. And all they still are is a coil, a diode, and an earphone. I mean, everything else about it is aesthetic, or they're adding additional coils, additional detecting devices. They might have 2 or 3 different cat whiskers, and you can switch because you have hot, cold, and lukewarm crystals. It was absurd. You know, they were just trying to milk that technology as long as they could during the early booming years of radio broadcast. But crystal radios are still popular today because they're simple and elegant and easy to build. Kids build them, and they're very fun. If you ever want to really experiment with early radio, buy an inexpensive crystal radio kit. This is actually just a screen capture from the Google Images at Amazon.com of crystal radios you can buy. They're everywhere. Build them from scratch. This is a real famous kind of a radio that somebody, in recent times built. It's a variation on what would have been called a foxhole radio back in World War I. Trench warfare, they want to know what's going on out in the real world. A rusty razor blade, a safety pin, they would have used pieces of tin eating ware to produce a capacitor and a coil of wire. And the rusty razor blade is also a semiconductor. You just find places on there where the rust, which is a crystalline form, is still kind of in a weird zone between being metal and being totally oxide, and you'd be able to detect, and they'd be able to receive signals using their communication headsets that they're using down the trenches to talk. So very difficult, but somebody built a recreation of that. Others go the other direction and go all beautiful and gorgeous. Again, so super simple that now you can focus on the aesthetic. So they're very, very popular still to this day. There's entire clubs devoted to crystal radios, and the plans on the web are absolutely everywhere. So it's very easy even today to get into crystal radio. But things had to change. The absurdity of building these crazy crystal radios, we have to usher in the new era. And the new era is the electron tube that was brought to us by John Fleming in England in 1904. And he started experimenting around and came up with something he called the Fleming valve, which is the world's first vacuum tube. These are his prototypes. And oddly enough, he didn't really understand how they worked. He just figured out that if you suck most of the air out of a glass jar and put a light bulb filament in there and a little piece of metal at the other end, the electrons will flow from the filament to the little piece of metal. He didn't really initially get what it was about until he did a lot more experiments, collaborated with a lot of other people, and then they realized that they had just created essentially an electronic, high-speed, perfectly accurate version of the Galena crystal. And it's called the Fleming valve, and it's the world's first electronic diode. Again, a rectifier capable of pulling signals out of the air. Huge improvement over Galena and the cat whisker detection concept. Very simple inside. Again, it's called a diode because there's 2 parts. There's at the bottom there's what amounts to a light bulb filament just at a very dull glow that's radiating electrons that get attracted to the little piece of metal up at the top. It's called the plate. And it's that flow of electrons moving through that tube that accomplishes the detection without going into all the physics of it and whatnot. But generally, that type of technology is called a diode. So this immediately launched the crystal radio world into a whole new realm of incorporating Fleming valves instead of Galena and cat's whiskers. But it's still, we have the problem, we can't hear it. It's just not loud enough, and it's still a solo device. So enter Lee DeForest, and this guy is really considered the father of modern radio by pretty much everybody in radio, just because he's the guy that gave us the triode and all of the other tubes that advanced from there. All tubes, in the museum, all the radios in here pretty much are tubes. Every single tube at its core is what DeForest created. It's what's called a triode. We add other stuff in there, other elements to it. You get pentodes, and you get all these other flavors. But the concept that DeForest developed is the core of every single tube that's in the museum. His very first triode was called the Audion, and all he did was, go back to my picture here. All he did was add a little piece of platinum wire into a Fleming valve. So here's a Fleming valve. We've got the light bulb band down here, which really was a little screw-in light bulb. And then we have a little metal bit over here that's the plate that we modified the light bulb to add some wires to pick up that. And all Fleming did, or DeForest did, is he added a little zigzag of platinum wire in between the two. That's it. Just that one little piece of wire. And that's what launched the modern era in electronics. It's called a triode because, again, there's three elements. The one that's pointed to here is the little squiggly wire, and called a triode because now there's three elements. But once you have a triode, once you have that little squiggly piece of wire, you can now amplify things. I'm not going to go into how and why, but it's miraculous how it works, and it's amazing, and we still use triodes on a regular basis today. Are still used by high-end audio people all over the world. Triodes are still used, just identical in almost every way to the early ones from DeForest. So now if we take a Fleming valve, which is inside this black box, and then we add one or even two audio triodes from DeForest, and what do you know? We now have a radio that can power a speaker into a room, and now all of a sudden radio becomes a social event. Now mom, dad, kids, we can all sit around the room and listen to radio programs that are now starting to appear in kind of random ways, little individuals just saying, hey, let's do this radio thing. The transmitter technology was improving in the background, which I'm not covering because it just goes too far astray if we do that. And within just a few years, the market was starting to flood with tube-type AM radios, and radio programs just started coming out everywhere. Again, mostly by individuals. We don't have commercial radio broadcasting yet. It's all just done by individuals that just have a passion for making fun stuff happen. This is an early ad for an Atwater Kent radio, and if you don't know, Arthur Atwater Kent was a rather wealthy industrialist, a kind of a gentleman's gentleman manufacturing guy, and he made what amounted to the Bugatti of radios. The early Atwater Kents sold for around $100 in the early teens, which was a lot of money. And by the time the company folded in the Great Depression, their radios were $295 was his last model in 1933 when the company folded. And that's the equivalent to about $4,500 today for a radio that plays the AM band. This is, as far as I've been able to determine, this is an actual radio advertisement for the radio you're seeing there, the Atwater Kent. The video is, I have to warn you, is whoever put it together, they're a little anachronistic, so you're going to see radios that have nothing to do with the 1910s. The important part here is just the audio, and this is what radio would have sounded like with an Audion-based early Atwater Kent about 1922, listening to an early commercial broadcast of an advertisement. The other thing about Lee DeForest that he's actually been recognized by Hollywood as being the only physicist inventor to have a star on oh, it's the Walk of Fame. There's actually a Leave Before a Star there, so he definitely figured high in their minds as well. And so from 1915 to 1925, now radio is just exploding. There's radio magazines couldn't come out fast enough. The Radio Times of England was a weekly blurb that had articles about radios, about upcoming shows. It was like the TV guide. Those were exploding all over the place about what radio programs are coming up this week for people to listen to. Now that it has become kind of this social network that people are sitting in their living rooms and now they're experiencing the greater world. Somebody in Omaha is hearing a broadcast that might be coming from somewhere in Europe that's been relayed, and they're hearing things that they would never ever hear otherwise. And during this period, 1915 to 1925, they weren't just listening; they were talking as well. And this was before the government regulation under the Radio Act of 1912. Now, a lot of the early experimenters with radio, they weren't content to just sit and listen to broadcasts. They wanted to transmit, and so they were building some behemoth transmitters, stuff that is just absolutely, frightening by today's standards. Transmitters running thousands and thousands of watts of energy to create a bigger and bigger spark to get a farther and farther distance. And of course, spark transmitting doesn't transmit on really a frequency. You kind of steer it to a range of frequencies, but it just bloody takes the whole thing. It's like the difference between a floodlight and a laser pointer. Modern radio is a laser pointer. The spark transmitter is a gigantic searchlight. So they're very, very different things. And this guy's particular transmitter, I'm going to show you a video of. He's actually running 13,800 volts, all open, all touchable on his transmitter. And this is actually a real transmitter that is owned by W2AN, which is a antique radio society back in New York, and was originally licensed as 2AN. And I put this down here. I do Morse code, and so I'll holler it out as they do them because there's enough time in between. But this is what he's transmitting in Morse code. He starts off with DE, which in Morse speak that's day or from. It's from in many foreign languages. He says 2AN, which is the historical call sign, but that's not legal. He has to then sign with W2AN, which is his legally assigned call sign by the FCC. Then he says test, another from, day, 2AN, W2AN, and then AR, which just means over. They allow this transmitter to go on air once a year by special permission from the FCC because it completely blanks out pretty much all radio communication for the 10 seconds that they do this. No radio communication happens in that neighborhood on any frequency. So give a listen to this and just imagine 13,800 volts in your living room. Okay. 2 a.m. W2AN. Test. Day. 2 a.m. W2AN. AR. Now, everybody knows the term Radio Shack, right? Right? Former term Radio Shack. Well, that term actually comes from transmitters like this. During this era, when these guys were getting this crazy about building this insanity level transmitter, unlike the very genteel little Marconi rig, they're building this kind of stuff. This is spewing oil because of the 10,000 RPM motor that's spinning, and ozone, and 13,800 volts, which you don't even have to touch it to die, just get close enough. No self-respecting housewife is going to let her husband put this inward in the house. And so what they would do is they would literally just build a shack out back to put this thing in. And on their radio nights, they'd go out there with their jug of bourbon, fire up the transmitter and see who they could talk to out in the shack. And that's where the term shack comes from. It's because that would not be allowed in any normal house, and for very obvious reasons. But that's the insanity that we were getting to around this year. So some good things happened with the Radio Act of 1912. The biggest one being that all of that information gleaned from the Titanic and how radio saved the 700 people that they did save, that were saved. All kinds of things were put into place about maritime radio, and including laws that are absolutely still in place to this day, that all commercial vessels maintain a 24-hour radio watch. You know, a commercial ship cannot have somebody not listening to the radio at any moment during the day. Part of the reason that we didn't get to the Titanic soon enough is because they were busy sending messages back home on our Carpathia, and they didn't hear the Titanic because their signal wasn't loud enough. And you know, so a lot of those rules are still in effect today. Another thing of the Radio Act of 1912 is now these amateurs, as they were called, and of course the word ham radio, that's just, you know, I'm an amateur actor, oh, you're just a ham. So that's not an acronym, it's just, you know, another word for amateur. But all these people that are doing this stuff, there's going to be rules now, kids. You can't just do this way anymore. So you have to get a license, you have to take a test, you have to prove you're not stupid enough to stick your hand in that 13,000 volt machine. You know, there had to be some sense brought into this, and they did start throttling in those death machines over the coming years. Those were outlawed very shortly thereafter. But the big thing that's going on in the World War I years, in 1917, as World War I is wearing down, the U.S. Signal Corps adopted radio during World War I, and wow, oh wow, did it change how things worked for the war effort. No more carrier pigeons, no more laying telegraph wires that would be cut by the enemy, no more semaphores that could be read by the enemy. And they were using smoke signal, all kinds of ways to communicate. Radio took care of all that and made it where we can actually get some things done. So the U.S. government, in a very unusual move for our government anyway, in 1917, they took complete control over all patents in the U.S. relating to radio. And they said, we own them, and you don't get to make anything. We will control everything that gets made. And this was to create a government-controlled monopoly on radio, and to allow the Signal Corps to have 100% of the output of all radio manufacturing. And this was in their thinking, was, I guess, to keep the enemy from being able to get these great American inventions that are coming down the pike. I'm assuming that was the thought process. But fortunately, Congress disagreed and shot down a bill in 1919 that closed the monopoly, and which would have probably been forever. Once, you know how the government is, once they get something, to ever unget it, we would be in a different world today, I think, if that bill had passed. And most of those patents were owned by General Electric, and so fortunately, GE got their patents back. They were at that time the #1 maker of radio products in the United States. So in 1919, after that bill failed, the government not just wanted to roll over and scratch its belly, they still want to control that technology. Damn it, they're going to get it. And so they decided they were going to set up a private monopoly or public monopoly in the public sector. Things were done by cartel back then. You know, if you were going to launch a new automobile, you had to apply to the automobile cartel and ask permission to build a new car. You didn't just launch a new car. That's what Henry Ford, he's the one who broke the back of the automotive cartel by saying, hey, heck with you, I'm going to sell cars and you can just do whatever you want to do. Well, it was a very common business tactic. So what the government wanted to do was create a cartel where GE would buy the American Marconi manufacturing company. And that way, those are the two main producers of radio gear at that time that were being sold to the military, were those two companies. And if GE owns both of them, now they have a monopoly. And if they would agree to do that, the U.S. Navy and Army would sole source all their radio purchases from those two companies. So that's when they formed RCA. The Radio Corporation of America was a cartel. It was the radio cartel. It was the RCA monopoly years. RCA didn't make anything. They owned it. And they became the Radio Corporation of America. And Not long thereafter, they created the cartel that they thought, and you know, the smoke-filled rooms working with the Admiral of the Navy, that they would ultimately end up in this complete strategic control of all radio. So they divided up in typical cartel fashion. They sat down and they divvied up profits. So AT&T, can you read that chart?
Yeah.
Okay. I did the Zoom thing because I thought it might not come out. So AT&T, they got 10.3% of the profits of all sales because they were doing radio telephone systems. The first long-distance phone calls were by radio through AT&T. General Electric, of course, was the biggest manufacturer of radio equipment in the United States at the time, so they got a 30% stake. Westinghouse was the third biggest manufacturer of radios, so they pulled them into the cartel and gave them a 20% stake. We'll get to the fruit one in a minute here. American Marconi was still the number 2, and combined with a few other inventors that the cartel wanted in their camp just to help develop some new technologies, they gave that group all under the American Marconi getting a 34.9 share. And of course RCA they were the cartel, so they got the lion's share of the after-tax profits. And they were the marketing arm for all of this. So RCA, at least in these years, didn't make anything, they just owned. Why United Fruit? Well, during the World War I years, bananas had become really, really popular in the U.S., and there were high-speed banana boats running between the places where bananas are grown in the U.S., because bananas don't last long on a boat. So they had to have small, high-speed boats, and it took a lot of coordination on those boats. So they had to develop their own specialized radios to keep all those boats moving the bananas quickly enough. So United Fruit actually got a 4% stake because they were actually developing and marketing radios for boats. And the government now had their monopoly, and they considered all radio products to be pretty much strategic. And what that really meant is that RCA never really saw advertising-based commercial radio and a massive explosion of global interest in radio. And radio station KDKA was actually founded by Westinghouse. Nobody told them they couldn't start a commercial radio station, and it's not strategic, so it's outside the cartel, right? So they launched radio station KDKA, becoming the first commercially licensed radio station in the world. And I say in the world because in the Netherlands, a station went on the air about a year earlier, PCCG in The Hague, but they weren't commercially licensed yet. So, you know, it's both, they were the first ones to be broadcasting on a big scale. KDKA was the first licensed radio station in the country. They're still on the air, no longer owned by Westinghouse. So just to put it in perspective now, as we're getting near the end of the show here. In 1922, there were only 26 commercial radio stations in the United States, but by the next year, 1 year later, there were 556 in the U.S. alone, in 1 year. That's how fast radio took off. So the radio market just exploded. From 1922 to 26, more than 600 U.S. firms began manufacturing radios in the United States. Now, a huge number of those dwindled away, because you know how that stuff goes. Everybody jumps on the wagon, they think they're going to have the next best thing, and only the strong survive. And you know, a lot of brands still, you know, at least we know their names like Zenith and Stromberg Carlson and Atwater Kent and Philco. And at least we know their names, but there were zillions and zillions of names that I wasn't going to have a list of, but just in the interest of time. You should Google it sometime, just the lists of the radio companies that came and went back then that we just don't hear of anymore. But the real explosion in radio that launches us into the true modern era was the work of Edwin Armstrong. And you know, as a radio guy, a passionate radio guy, he's my personal hero. Fessenden is he's the inventor. Edwin Armstrong is just, he's the guy that really gave us a lot. And the very first thing that he gave us is a regenerative detector system, a regen receiver. It was an early form of complete receiver system. So we're not just talking a detector here so much as it's kind of a whole system now. Now we're talking about not just individual pieces, but it all works together as a whole. And the regenerative receivers work fabulously, they're super, super sensitive. And now we're able to start listening to shortwave broadcasts from around the world, because now we have that insane sensitivity that you can get from regenerative. But the crowning glory of what Armstrong did was, well, in this picture here, a lot of hobbyists still build regenerative receivers. I built many of them over my life that look much like the one in the picture there. But the real thing that he gave us, gave the world, was his development of what is called the super heterodyne receiver. And the super heterodyne receiver is the basis of all analog radios to this day. The radio you were listening to as you drove up in your car is virtually identical in concept and implementation to what Edwin Armstrong designed. That's still the technology we use. I mean, now, granted, there's stuff coming called SDR, that's software-defined radio that's a little different, but the super heterodyne is our modern radio. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring it to this point, because once we get to the super heterodyne, then the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, I mean, now we have this proliferation of super heterodyne receivers that now we have this really stable, really nice sounding, really loud, well-defined, hundreds of stations to listen to. So now we get to just get creative and build beautiful designs, and that's what you see in the museum. So you're not going to learn about Maxwell and Fleming in the museum, you're going to see the beautiful radios that came in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So that's kind of how I structured it to be, so that you go into the museum and see the radios. And when you're looking at the radios, if you haven't already, look at them in the light of how we look at technology today. As trendy as informational or whatever as our gizmos and gadgets are today, radio is absolutely 100% where that flows people down, and later television as well. I use my phone to get news and information. They use their radio to get news and information. Same with computers. So, technology is a continuum, and you don't know what the next thing is. So if you don't know what the next thing is, the current thing is the best. And the people that were listening to these radios in that era, that was their iPhones and their laptops and stuff. And I like to have a solid respect for that and understand that it was that important to them that people would spend a lot of money on some of these really beautiful cases. And this comment here, how it opened the world of news and entertainment, things that they just had not experienced before that. So as you go through and look at all the radios, these are actual just little snaps of a whole bunch of the radios in here, just kind of in a little artistic flow. Just think about all the stuff that it took, all the technology that had to develop to get there, and more importantly than that, think back on all those names that we've been over and countless others that we didn't have time to go into. That this whole idea of radio didn't just one day just happen. It was an enormous effort by an enormous number of people. And other than Fessenden, all the rest of them are just out there somewhere in the noise, right? Because I am a Fessenden. So just one last thing here.
That wraps it up for tonight's show, folks. Tune in next Thursday for more guest appearances and those advertisements we all love and enjoy. Have a great night.
They really did. If you read about early commercials, people actually would listen, they would wait for the commercials. A lot of them were fun and campy, and it was all new. So anyway, that's the presentation. I thank you for coming. Any questions?
Did you want to get one plug for the radio club?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. I didn't know if that was necessarily
Yeah.
I'm a member of the Radio Club at Tacoma. I'm actually the presentations manager, and I do this kind of stuff. This is what I do for the club. This is actually going to be our next presentation at the club. My wife, Ann, at the back, she's N7ANN. She's refreshments coordinator for the club. We meet every second Wednesday? Yeah, every second Wednesday of the month at the Pierce County Library Administrative Branch at 112th and Waller Road East. It's just a little off that. But if you go to w7bk.org, w7bk.org, it has all the details about our club. On Saturday mornings, every Saturday at 1249 South Washington, we have a little 2-3 hour get together and chit chat, and everybody's welcome. You don't have to be a ham radio guy. You don't have to know anything about radio, but you want to learn. If you go to the radio clubhouse on a Saturday morning, we've got a museum upstairs of old radios, lots of old amateur radio equipment, including a small spark gap transmitter, a little baby one. And we would love to have you there. We also have our formal meeting the second Wednesday of the month at 7:30 is when it begins. Social hour starts at 7, and we always have an interesting program either from me or from a presenter that I might bring in to present at the club. So there's always something interesting to do there with refreshments. And you can learn about ham radio. Ham radio is still very much alive. As a matter of fact, there's a radio sport contest going on this weekend that's in Morse code. 100% Morse code, and I'll be participating in that this afternoon some. It's a great hobby, and we'd love to see you come out to the club sometime. And I've got some business cards up here too. I have an email address if anybody thinks of any questions or whatever they might want to ask after the fact.
Dave, you got a question back here?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
On the meetings at the library, are they open to the public then?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and there's no charge. You do not have to be a member. And you just show up. Again, it's the Saturday morning one is from 10 to 2 at 1249 South Washington. The general meeting is the second Wednesday of the month. Social hour starts at 7 and meeting starts at 7:30. Presentation usually starts about 8, goes till about 8:45.
And that's at the Pierce County Library Administration Center?
Yes.
Yeah, the administration center. Yeah. So while I'm tearing down, I'll leave some cards up here just in case anybody would want to email me a follow-on question or whatever, just so you have some contact.